Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, sound check. Can everybody hear me all right? Should I increase the volume? Okay. Did you hear that, Walker? Crank it up a little bit. Okay. Now is it all right? Testing 1, 2, 3. Is that all right? Okay, good. And so welcome and thanks for coming out on this rainy day on December 1st to hear the first of 2 Wednesday at 2 talks by me. I'm not wearing a mask because I'm 6 feet away from the closest person, but thank you all for wearing your masks throughout the presentation today. And I'm David Stark. I am Chief Curator Emeritus at the Columbus Museum of Art. I didn't put my name on this screen, but the title of the talk, Through Vincent's Eyes, Part 1, The Art of Van Gogh, refers to the exhibition that I will be covering. And Part 2 will be, my topic today is are the works by Van Gogh in the exhibition Through Vincent's Eyes, Van Gogh and His Sources. 2 weeks from today, I will be talking about the sources, the works not by Van Gogh in the exhibition, but works by those artists that served as his inspiration, his sources. May I ask who, if you could raise your hands, who has seen the exhibition already? Great. And can I have hands, those who have not seen it yet, maybe are planning to go after the talk? Wow, that's great. So that's about half and half. And can I also ask, has anybody heard me speak before on this exhibition, come to a prior lecture? So some of you have. So I have to apologize. It's impossible for me to not repeat some of the things that I've said in terms of basic information in prior lectures, but I tried to make this as fresh and as new, introducing additional material so that for those of you who have heard me talk on this topic or on the exhibition, it will be different. So just going into the basics, the exhibition will run here through the holidays. It will close on February 6th. And then our partner in the exhibition, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, will be showing a slightly different version of the exhibition. There's much overlap, but we have some works that they don't and vice versa. That will run from February 27th to late May in 2022. And for those of you who have seen the exhibition, many people are aware that the works by Van Gogh, and there are 17 that I'll be talking about, are marked by what we're calling the blue stripes. That is from the floor to the ceiling, stripes around the works of art by Van Gogh, so that when you enter any one of the 10 galleries, it will be apparent which works are by Van Gogh, as in this example. And at the beginning, again, for those who've seen it, you know that there is a timeline that shows the different phases of Van Gogh's life and career. And that is, of course, chronologic. That is the order or sequence of my talk today. But the way that the exhibition is organized is not chronologic. It's arranged according to theme. Themes like portraits, religion, landscape, rustic life, and so on. And the reason for that is that I had to work around the fact that we have many more works, over 100, by artists that inspired Van Gogh versus works by Van Gogh. And so it made a lot more sense to surround the works by Van Gogh by those of the artists who inspired him. Whoops. The projectionist warned me. Sometimes when I click, they won't advance right away. So be patient, which I was not. This is an example of the first chunk of the timeline and I tried to characterize the different phases of Van Gogh's life and art. So I talk about a restless youth and commitment to art at the age of 27. So Van Gogh, born in I was born in 1953. He was born in 1853. I always think, my God, what if I had died in 1990, right? Van Gogh's life was so short, 1853 to 1890. And he only began painting at age 27. and he was dead within 10 years. So 1880 to 1890, he produced almost 2,000 artworks. So he was extremely productive and prolific once he made up his mind to produce art, which didn't happen right away. He was born the son of a preacher in a small town in the rural Netherlands called Zundert. And his parents moved. His father was assigned to different churches or parsonages. So he moved to various places like Etten and Nuenen, which we have identified on the map at the beginning of the exhibition by the timeline. And he did attempt, and this is the only known photograph of him. This is Vincent at age 19. And after very minimal formal education, he got a job as a teenager early in life. At age 16, he was hired by the art auction house and art dealer was called Goupil and Company. It was an international auction house. It had branches. It was based in Paris, but it had branches in other cities like London and a branch in The Hague where a relative of Van Gogh was employed. So that was one of the key reasons that he got a job at Goupil. And eventually his brother was hired as well. And Vincent lasted there for about 7 years, which is about the longest period in which he ever held down a job, for 7 years. And they bounced him around. He started out in The Hague, the capital of the Netherlands, and they transferred him to their offices in London and Paris until he finally had enough. So beginning in The Hague, which is the capital of the Netherlands, even though Amsterdam is a larger city, The Hague is the government capital, and from Paris to London. And finally, it was while he was working in the Paris office that he was dismissed / quit. The problem with Van Gogh and employers or schools that he attended was his temperament and personality, which was very difficult. He was very passionate. He was quick-tempered, and he was not inhibited about asserting himself and rubbing himself the wrong way against people that hired him or supervised him. And so there are a lot of dismissals, firings, quittings, etc. And I should also mention that Goupil was renamed in the early 1880s, Bussard Valadon and Company, but it was still essentially the same auction house. And this gives you an idea of this is a showroom of Goupil and Company in The Hague, which gives you a sense of how high-end the auction house was. They sold original works of art and prints and reproductions in the form of fine art prints as well. And the other attempts before his commitment to art at jobs and work by Van Gogh included enrolling in divinity school to become a preacher like his father. He was even a teacher in England for a time in Ramsgate, which is near the English Channel, not far from Dover, and Isleworth, which is on the west side of London. He taught math and English, but that only lasted for about 6 months. And and this is not complete, this is not chronologic order, these are just highlights of Van Gogh's failed attempts at work or school. In 1877, for about 5 months, he worked in Dordrecht at a bookseller, at a bookshop, as a bookseller or a clerk in the bookshop. And you may recall an exhibition from 2019 here, Art in the Age of Rembrandt, Treasures from the Dordrecht Museum. And that exhibition included works not only from the 17th century, the century of Rembrandt, but went all the way through the 19th century to some of the artists that I'll talk about today, the Hague School, showing that Rembrandt had a very broad influence through the centuries. But just to connect that phase, that brief phase in Van Gogh's career to something that we've had at the museum, and also calling attention to the importance of books in Vincent's life in terms of sources of inspiration. He was very literate, he was multilingual, in addition to his native language of Dutch, he spoke French and German and English. And in his childhood, his family had books that they read and that he read and that were read aloud, novels like The Count of Monte Cristo or The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. And part of our exhibition includes displays of editions of books that influenced Van Gogh that were published in the 19th century, early editions of those books. So being a bookseller didn't work out. Then he tried being a missionary in southern Belgium in a mining region known as the Borinage, but he just ended up being either ridiculed or frightened or frightening the miners that he was supposed to be helping, because he went to extremes in terms of trying to minister them and live like him. So he gave up his possessions, his clothes. He tried to live in these squalid quarters that the miners lived in, and they didn't quite see the point of what he was doing or how he was trying to help them. So he was dismissed. And then when he was unemployed during these various fallow periods, he moved back in with his parents, who, as I mentioned, moved around to towns like Ayton and Noonan, always in these rural areas of the Netherlands. And so when he determined that he was going to devote his energy and time and efforts to becoming an artist, that occurred in 1880. He spent a couple of years working in black and white, in primarily producing drawings. And that was typical in the 18th, 19th centuries, even in the early 20th century. The typical artist training involved first learning how to draw and work with line and elements of composition, independent of the greater complexities of color, brushwork, et cetera, involved with painting. And the earliest work that we have in the exhibition, and I'm glad to say that we have virtually all periods in Van Gogh's career represented in the exhibition, the earliest being this drawing of the marsh with water lilies at Etten. And so this was done at a time during which he had moved back in with his parents. They were living in the small town of Etten. And he was much influenced in his early work by the Hague School, which, well, I should have put the Hague School because the town is The Hague. It was a movement. It wasn't a literal school, but a group of artists that congregated around The Hague, which is close to the coast. And they painted landscapes, farm animals, peasants, fishermen and their families. And they worked in a palette that was what's called tonalist, basically overall single earth-colored tone that colored the entire painting or canvas. They emphasize the gray, overcast climate and low horizons of the Netherlands. Sometimes they were called the gray school because of their palette and the emphasis on those gray skies. And in a drawing like this, you see the attention to the natural environment by Van Gogh, with certain characteristics that follow through in his career, such as the high horizon line, rather than the more traditional low horizon that you see in many Dutch landscapes from the 17th century in Rembrandt's age to the Hague School, which puts a lot of emphasis on the skies and the clouds. But Van Gogh, by raising the horizon line, flattens the space, calls our attention to the surface of his composition. And to me, fascinating element of this early drawing is the abstract strength of his lines and patterns and shapes of the plant life in this marshy area. He could still, just using the medium of line and black and white, give a sense of the shimmering water, the motion of the lily pads and the plants drifting across the surface of the water or blowing in the wind, some birds, and the shifting of the clouds in the sky. So it's a very animated landscape. And there's a sense of celebration in the landscapes by Van Gogh that has in some measure to do with his faith in God and his the residual effect of his upbringing in a household that was run by a minister, a preacher. And so he saw God in nature, or what is often referred to as pantheism. And he was helped in these early years by various members of the Hague School that he came in contact with, one of whom was Anton van Rappard, who actually accompanied him on the trip to the marshes. He lived elsewhere in the Netherlands, but visited Van Gogh when he was living at home in Ayton, and went to the same marsh on the same day, apparently, as Van Gogh, and painted his own version of the marsh with a lower horizon line and a more conventional style compared to Van Gogh. And I'm happy to say that this painting in our exhibition by Van Rappard is hanging very close to, it's to the right of the drawing of the marsh. Even though this is not a self-portrait of the artist, it has nothing to do with the marsh painting. In fact, it was done a year after Van Gogh died, but it is a work by an artist that was influential in this early phase to Van Gogh, and it represents the kind of person that Van Gogh was drawn to in his paintings. This is a blind brush maker, so it's someone who is an unfortunate, marginalized individual that still shows dignity and strength. And Van Gogh is particularly attracted to the downtrodden in society. And so here's another early work, this from 1882. And by this time, he had moved into The Hague, as I explained, the capital city of the Netherlands. And he was taken under the wing of a cousin by marriage by the name of Anton Malva, one of whose works in the exhibition you see on the right. And Malva was a member of the Hague School. And these characteristics that I talked about, the tonalism, the gray overcast skies, the concentration on peasant life and landscape. And I also should have mentioned loose brushwork. It's a movement that overlaps with Impressionism. It coalesced a little before the Impressionist movement, but Impressionism is based on loose, spontaneous brushwork and divided color. But unlike the Hague School, the Impressionists' colors palette was much lighter and brighter. But at any rate, Van Gogh's cousin, Malva, or sometimes it's pronounced Mauve, depending upon a Germanic or a French pronunciation, but I usually say Malva. He provided Van Gogh with a studio in The Hague on the outskirts of the city. And you see when Van Gogh painted cities, whether it was Paris or The Hague, it wasn't the fashionable heart of the city or more picturesque buildings, but usually on the outskirts, showing the working classes and their environment. And you see a worker in clogs and a blue worker's smock trudging through the foreground with houses, workers' houses in the middle ground. And then in the background, church steeples and smokestacks on the right. And this is in a section of the exhibition that I thematically devoted to religion. Why religion? Because of these church steeples. And the one on the left, you see a pavilion-style sloped roof. That was the so-called new church in The Hague that dates to the 17th century. And that was a Baroque or a 17th century Protestant church versus the great church, or the Church of St. James, the Grote or St. Jacobskerk. And that taller tower belongs to a church that was once Catholic, originally Catholic, but in the 16th or 17th century, when the Netherlands broke from its southern neighbor, Flanders, or today Belgium, the Catholic Church, and largely over religion, the Catholic churches were converted to Protestant structures. And if you're wondering, why doesn't this tower look like the photograph, the tower in the photograph of the church? That's because in the 19th century, when Van Gogh painted this church, a neo-Gothic 19th century cast iron crown was added to the steeple that looked like this, so that it actually does conform to the appearance of the steeple in the photograph. But this cast iron neo-Gothic topping or crown was removed in 1957 because it was damaging the tower. Below it, structurally, the tower was beginning to crack. So they restored the appearance to its, well, not its original medieval appearance, because as with most churches from the Middle Ages in Europe, there were different building phases, or there were damages or fires. So this is more like a Renaissance steeple on an originally medieval church. And just as a reminder of what happened in the Netherlands when Protestant churches, when Catholic churches were turned into Protestant houses of worship, they were stripped of the Catholic artwork inside. And this is an example in our permanent collection in Gallery 10. It's not in the exhibition, but it's in the Ross wing in this building. I call it the Grand Salon or Salon. It's Gallery 10, where we have double and triple hangings of paintings from the Renaissance to the 18th century. And we have this 17th century Dutch interior of a church in Delft that was once a Catholic church, was turned Protestant. So the only paintings or the things hanging on the walls would be family crests or memorials to the deceased, and they're deliberately plain looking. And this distinction between Protestant and Catholic was very, Van Gogh was sensitive to it because his father was a Protestant preacher with the Dutch Reformed Church who preached in a Catholic area of the Netherlands, in southern Netherlands, which borders on Belgium, which remained a Catholic country. And part of this personality of Van Gogh is being used to going against the grain, might be attributed to the fact that his father was this resolute Protestant preacher in a predominantly Catholic area of the Netherlands, and so sometimes not always welcomed by in the area in which he conducted his services and ministry. And also, this is interesting because note that alongside the church steeples, there's smokestacks belching smoke and polluting the air, and it blends in with the gray clouds. And then you have birds. So you have this synthesis of the man-made and the natural environment coming together in this lively, animated tableau of contemporary life. And another work in this section on religion is a print of the painting that Van Gogh considered his first important monumental painting. So he's painting on a larger scale now, and planned a large composition called The Potato Eaters that was produced during another period in which he lived at home, where he'd moved in with his parents, now in the town of Noonan. And he painted a family, a rustic family, that was preceded by studies of heads of peasant women, something like 20, 30 heads, individual portraits, if you will, of individuals in the area that he finally decided to put together in or use as sources for this large composition of a multi-generational family sitting down to a meal of coffee and potatoes. And there were several versions of the composition. This is an early preliminary painted study that he got so excited about that he wanted to share his composition with other friends and artists. So he produced a lithograph that you see in the exhibition. There were about 18 copies of this lithograph that he produced that's essentially the technique of drawing on stone and inking the drawing for an impression. It's much more complicated than that, but basically the point I want to make is that it looks like a drawing because he did draw on stone, but it's a reverse. The composition is in reverse because he took the painting as his guide that he was working on, and then when you press the paper on top, the image comes out in reverse. And so here's the final composition. This is in the end. I tried to be very conscientious in pointing out in my captions, not in exhibition. So these, and some of these are reproduced on the labels of the works that we do have, but this lithograph then is related to primarily this preliminary version that's in a smaller Dutch museum, in a great museum in Otterlo in the Netherlands. And it has been pointed out that there are many sources for a peasant family at mealtime prior to this version by Van Gogh, one of which is by one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent Hague School painter, Joseph Israels, who focused not so much on landscapes as peasants. So a very famous painting called The Frugal Meal by Israels resembles the composition of family at mealtime. But what interests me, and one of the reasons that it's in the religion section of the exhibition, are the references that Van Gogh made to a 19th century Belgian painter, the leader of realism in Belgium, Charles de Gogh, that he mentions frequently in his letters. And he talks about this painting by de Gogh, Grace Before the Meal, at least 5 times in correspondence as he wrote about the development of his painting of the potato eaters. And this family is saying grace. It's a religious, it's a depiction of a religious ritual. And the letters of Van Gogh make reference to the resemblance of this composition to The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. So by implication, the gathering around the mealtime table, even though it's coffee and potatoes rather than bread and wine, there is the passing of food from one person to another, similar to somewhat to a communion. And then note that the light around the head of the figure saying grace makes him almost like a holy figure, similar to Leonardo's natural halo of light around Christ, who's in front of a window with sunlight coming in. And then, whoops, there is, I knew I would do this, there is a crucifixion above the head of the male figure, on the right in the print, on the left in the painting, indicating, yes, this is a Christian family. They have no doubt said grace before the meal. There's that sense of family bonding. And often the prominence of this single lamp, a candle or a light in interior space is often an indication of the presence of God. And so much of de Gogh's work, even though the topics and subjects are ostensibly secular, have religious overtones in them. So there's that, so much for religion in that section of the exhibition. Now, Van Gogh moves to Paris to be with his brother, who has meanwhile been hired to work after serving in other branches of Goupil and Company, is working the Paris branch. He has an apartment on the outskirts of the city in the neighborhood of Montmartre. And so Van Gogh rooms with his brother in Paris. And a great advantage of that change in city is that the Netherlands is looked at as a kind of backwater in terms of contemporary art, the really hot spot where the most progressive vanguard movements were taking place was in Paris. It was the art capital of Europe. And so Van Gogh was very much inspired and influenced by the exposure to movements like Impressionism that he was exposed to. And a side-by-side hanging comparison in the gallery that I called Impressionism and After, meaning Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, those two movements that dominate the end of the 19th century in Paris. The comparison consists of Alfred Sisley, a bona fide Impressionist painter. I talked about the sketchy brushwork, the spontaneity, the sense of movement, and bright sunlit colors, and the painting in the open air, which you see adapted by Van Gogh. And similar to the kind of Impressionism of Sisley, which wasn't universal among other Impressionists like Renoir or Monet, who tended to, when they did paint the city, show the fashionable areas and neighborhoods and modern life with fashionably dressed people. At a certain point, Sisley goes to the rural areas or the edges of the city and paints a more working class environment with a shed, a boat dockyard. And similarly, Van Gogh will depict the Montmartre area in which he lived with his brother, which was semi-rural. Now it's within the greater Paris metropolitan area. It's just a district within the city. But in Van Gogh's time, he looked in a certain direction and it was essentially rural. And his focus in this particular example is on a shed. But you can see the lightening, brightening of his palette. And there are many quotes in the exhibition, and most of them come from the letters by Van Gogh to his brother Theo, with whom he established a correspondence quite early in life that continued until his dying day or days. And in this instance, Sisley, the most tactful and sensitive of the Impressionists, which shows that he was not only influenced by the art of Sisley, but he knew the man. He's talking about the personality of Sisley, basically, that this is a really nice guy. And this is a painting that was influential, or a style of painting that was influential to me as well. And there were a small number of painters that were up and comers that weren't really that well known compared to the, by then, established figures like Renoir, Gogh, and Monet, but painters like, and painters and printmakers like Toulouse-Lautrec, other Impressionists like Camille Pissarro, these were the people that Van Gogh knew personally and socialized with, to a limited extent, in as much as people could socialize with an artist with a difficult personality like Van Gogh. Sometimes they tolerated him more than socialized with him. That might be a better way of putting it. But with his brother Theo, Van Gogh, and he actually did organize some exhibitions with these artists. They also included Louis Anquetin and Emile Bernard. And I'll talk in my next lecture more about these other artists with whom Van Gogh associated. But this transition to Impressionism didn't happen right away. He went back and forth at certain points, and when he first moved to Paris, his paintings like this, another image of the outskirts of Paris, show the continued influence of the Hague School, the gray skies, the earth-toned tonalist palette, and these working class figures. This might be a veteran or a soldier or a former soldier trudging through the foreground. But on the other hand, you've got these other works that clearly show the influence of Impressionism. And by the way, Asnières, that's a suburban area of Paris. He spent some happy summer days there in the presence of Emile Bernard, one of these Impressionists slash post-Impressionists that he socialized with, and whose parents had a summer home or not a summer home, a new home in Asnières. And that was one of the occasions or the reasons for Van Gogh's visit to that area and the painting of this bridge. And I have it exhibited near a painting from our permanent collection of Monet landscape. And I think you can see the connection. And there are a number of works from our permanent collection that are in the exhibition. And here's another work from his Paris period showing the detached, spontaneous impressionist brushstroke and different colors laid side by side that blend in the eye, optical blending when you see them from a distance. And the still life is a venerable Dutch tradition going back to the 17th century. It was something that Van Gogh found easy to, a subject that allowed him to experiment, that was easy to set up. A bunch of flowers and a vase. And it was inexpensive, it was quick. And so a painting like this demonstrates not only that particular phase of his artistic development, but it has been the subject of recent scientific examination, X-ray, infrared, chemical analysis of paint, et cetera. And it was just authenticated only a few years ago as being a genuine work by Vincent van Gogh, certified by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, whereas there had been some doubt about its authenticity for quite a few years, but it is borrowed from the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And another interesting feature about this painting is that X-ray or analysis of the painting has resulted in the discovery of the painting of a figure, apparently by Van Gogh, underneath the flowers, possibly a self-portrait, indicating that these were his lean years in which he reused canvases. And then rapidly assimilating these different avant-garde movements. You see him experimenting with pointillism, sometimes called Neoimpressionism, which is reformed impressionism, still using divided color optical blending, but applying the brushstrokes in a more precise, careful, calculated manner, as in this detail by the initiator of the Neo-Impressionist or pointillist movement, Georges Seurat. And so this is introduced to French painting in 1886. And you can see the change in Van Gogh's style in the way that his painting is now. It's applied in small dabs of paint. It's inaccurate to say that pointillism consists only of dots. It does consist of points or dots of paint, but also very precise, tiny little vertical or horizontal strokes as well, cross-hatching or vertical, horizontally oriented strokes. And this area that he is painting, by the way, the Grandshot, so it is literally an island in the Seine, a little to the south of the city center, but the painting that I just showed of Agnières is near the Grandshot, so they're almost within eye shot of one another. So that maybe helps locate where at least one of these paintings was produced. And then a final note about, talking about the history or the lore connected with these paintings. This is in the private collection of Larry Ellison. It was the subject of an article by Van Gogh scholar Martin Bailey that was published online in the artnewspaper.com. If you're interested, just Google artnewspaper.com. And he's, I think, according to Forbes, the 7th richest man in the world, this collector who generously lent this painting. And he runs a software company, or founded a software company that's second only to Microsoft. At any rate, what's really of interest about this painting, according to this article by Bailey, is that it had hung in what was formerly called the Hotel Texas, the Fort Worth Hotel, in the room that Jackie Kennedy and John F. Kennedy stayed in the night before the assassination in Fort Worth. And it was lent along with about 5 other paintings by private collectors in Texas to decorate the room. And President Kennedy called the person who lent it to thank her for lending that beautiful painting, Ruth Carter, later Ruth Carter Stevenson. And Jackie got on the line too and said, I just love this painting. I don't want to leave this room. And if only she hadn't, because the motorcade then, and he gave his last speech at the Kennedy in front of this hotel, and there's a memorial statue to him. I stayed in this hotel and didn't realize, at a conference a few years ago, and didn't realize that this was the hotel. It's now the Hilton Fort Worth, until I noticed the statue, and then and there were a lot of black and white photographs in the corridors, and I put it all together. So a little history of that painting that has nothing to do with Van Gogh, but I still think it's interesting. Then, so finally, this is where Van Gogh comes into his own, and this is a style that is most familiar to us, his mature style that comes with his move from Paris to Arles. He got sick and tired of the infighting and bickering among artists in Paris. His health was not in the best shape, and moving to a warmer, sunnier environment where it was cheaper, he didn't have to pay for heat. It was thought that it would help his disposition, this warm, sunny environment with the slower pace of life. This small town in southern France is where his mature style that was introduced in his last year in Paris really blossomed, as you can see in this loan of a wheat field from the Honolulu Museum of Art. And he moved to southern France in February, when there was still snow on the ground. And by the summertime, he celebrated the beauty of the natural environment around him with paintings like this that show his tendency towards piling up the thick, heavily textured impasto on the surface of the canvas. And if you see this, or look at it again, if you've already seen the show, the texture and the pile up of paint in the upper portion with the clouds in this painting is quite remarkable. And the variety of brushstrokes, the highlights on the tops of these stalks of wheat and the stubble in the field around them really is a distinguishing feature of his mature style, as is this tendency to flatten space and create zones with outlines filled in with areas of flat color. And he really, as I said, comes into his own in this Arles period. This is another work of the wheat fields, or the farmland around the town of Arles. And it shows the direct influence of another important set of painters, French painters. The Barbers school were landscape painters who coalesced in the village of Barbers to the south of Paris, near the forest of Fontainebleau. And these painters, like the Hague School, painted peasants, farm animals, landscapes in a style that relied in part working in the open air instead of producing their entire works in the studios. And sometimes they're called pre-impressionists, the Barbizon School. And the leader of that school, kind of the counterpart of Joseph Israels with the Hague School, is Jean-Francois Millet, one of whose famous paintings, The Sower, is in our exhibition. There's a more famous version of The Sower in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but this from the Carnegie is a beautiful example that Van Gogh uses and kind of plugs in Millet, or electrifies him with this brilliant color, and the way in which now, instead of a more naturalistic sky, distorts the color and colors the entire sky yellow with these pulsating strokes representing the intensity of the sunlight. And so there is this neo-impressionist in this example, not in the exhibition, but connecting it with the prevalence of the post-impressionist, neo-impressionist style or movement that is represented in another gallery called Landscape and Literature. This painting, the Tarascon Stagecoach, also from his Arles period, also representing that southern French small town environment with outmoded forms of transportation. Trains were replacing stagecoaches. And these are stagecoaches in the small town of Tarascon, a little to the north of Arles. And the day is sunny. It's in the middle of the afternoon. The stage coaches are waiting for passengers, but it's lunchtime. It's siesta at the tradition in Southern Europe, where everything closes and a nice, long, leisurely lunch takes place. Shops and houses are shuttered, and this really illustrates the way in which Van Gogh was happy at certain points in this slower paced southern sunny environment. And it is exhibited next to work by Signac that has another impressionist slash post-impressionist who worked in this instance in the pointillist style with the a composition that is very similar. And I owe this comparison, and he helped procure the loan, to Stephen Nafy, who's the author of one of the books that I'll show the cover of at the very end, Van Gogh and the Artist He Loved, a book that Stephen Nafy wrote and had published specifically as a kind of companion publication with this exhibition. And Steve Nafy co-wrote the biography of Van Gogh called Van Gogh, the Life, published in 2011 with Gregory White Smith, the late Gregory White Smith. And their collection of works by artists that inspired Van Gogh makes up a considerable portion of our exhibition. They lent 67 works to the exhibition and helped with loans like this. So we're so grateful to Stephen Nafy. And even more important is to the style of Van Gogh in this Arles period is the influence of Paul Gauguin, who painted peasants in the area in Brittany, the village of Pont-Aven, and had also done paintings in the South Seas. And his distinctive style of outlining and solid color and reliance on the traditions of small town rural life, in particular, Christian Catholic customs of the people of Brittany that he chronicled were so important to Van Gogh. And Van Gogh invited Gauguin to join him in Arles, and he thought that the two of them would form the nucleus of a painter's colony in southern France that in Van Gogh's mind, he called, in his letters, he called it the Studio of the South, that he thought would represent a renewal of a progressive French painting in this small town in Arles. Well, it wasn't to be. Gauguin and Van Gogh painted side by side in Arles for a few months, October to around Christmas time. There was continuous friction and arguments. And eventually, Van Gogh had one of his spells, so to speak, and did mutilate part of one ear that mortified and frightened Gauguin, so that he sped out of Arles, took the next train to Paris a few days before Christmas, and the two never saw each other again, although they did continue to write and correspond periodically. And in brighter times before that final rupture, Van Gogh prepared the building in which the two were going to stay. It was called the Yellow House, a building near the train station of Arles, where Van Gogh had procured spaces for studios for both of them. They both had their own bedrooms, and Van Gogh decorated the walls with a number of paintings, different versions of sunflowers that he's most famous for. This is one of the versions in the National Gallery, not an exhibition, but this Tarascon stagecoach was one of the works with which he decorated the Yellow House in preparation for Gauguin's visit. So it's a painting with a lot of art historical interest. And the source of the painting was a story by, and I'm not making this up, we know this because he wrote about it in one of his letters to Theo, that he was thinking about this book, this novel that he liked a lot by Alphonse Daudet. And we have one of Daudet's books, not with this story, Tantarin de Tarascon, in the exhibition within eyeshot of the painting. But it was a story about a rider of this stagecoach, which, and it says Service de Tarascon right on it, a service to, or the route to Tarascon. It was a commuter stagecoach between the towns of Nîmes and Tarascon. And the story was about the imaginary the musings of a passenger in the stagecoach who daydreamed of hunting lions or tigers in North Africa as he was riding this kind of pedestrian, dreary stagecoach route. And at one point in the story, the stagecoach is personified and speaks in the voice of an elderly lady who talks about the glory days when this commuter stagecoach was at its height in taking passengers between these two southern French cities. So an odd story, but something that Van Gogh found very endearing and which literally inspired him to paint this work. And then after the tragedy of the rupture between Gauguin and Van Gogh, his mental health was failing. He committed himself in 1889 to a psychiatric asylum in Saint-Rémy that was not very far from Arles, spent over a year there. And during his lucid periods, he continued to paint, including this still life that if you've seen the exhibition, you know that it's at the opening of the show. It's the first Van Gogh painting that you see as you enter. And so this is another example of an easy kind of subject for Van Gogh to paint. He could have gathered these flowers from the grounds of the asylum and then borrowed a vase in which he painted them. And this does show his mature style, the flat space, the background, although flat, is animated by these curved brushstrokes that infuse the painting with lots of energy. And there's a lot of emphasis on the flat decorative shapes of the flowers. And part of that comes from inspiration of Japanese prints. And I could have introduced these kinds of comparisons way back when I started talking about Impressionism in Paris in Van Gogh's work. But these Japanese prints flooded into Europe in the 19th century. Sometimes they were used as wrapping paper for porcelain. There wasn't a lot of value attached to them in the minds of many at the time. But now we look at them as these beautiful evocations of, they're called, oh, here it is, ukiyo-e prints, or images of the floating world. And that's a Buddhist concept about the fleeting nature of life and the small moments that we should appreciate looking at nature or landscapes or everyday activities. And stylistically, the influence of Japanese prints, I think it's really evident. And we have about 4 or 5 Japanese prints by both Hokusai and Hiroshiga in the exhibition. And I think you can see the influence of the flat decorative shapes, the flattening of space. And in many instances, these Japanese prints have asymmetrical compositions. That's not the case here, but the influence, especially on these beautiful shapes of the flowers, their outlines, their silhouettes, and the leaves and blossoms against the background. The comparison is particularly striking. And this is a painting that was where the flowers were originally pink. The red pigment used to paint them has faded and it's degraded, and which sometimes happens. It's called fugitive colors. And so even though they're white, and you see little traces of red in parts of the composition, but it's still very beautiful. And he produced, this is one of the paintings he produced towards the end of his stay in Saint-Rémy, when he eventually felt well enough to move out. And he could not take these paintings directly with him when he made the move to his final place of residence, the small town of Auvers, north of Paris, because the paint hadn't dried. I mentioned that he piled up paint in very thick, heavy strokes, and the surfaces of the paintings are very rough and uneven, and purposefully so. And so the paint just hadn't dried, so they couldn't be transported. And kindly, one of the staff members of the asylum had this and other paintings transported to his final place of residence in Auvers-sur-Oise. After the paint had dried. So just a few other, here's another comparison. This hangs next to the Saint-Remy still life of roses, a painting by Manet, M-A-N-E-T. And Van Gogh wrote about this a painting by Manet of peonies that might not have been this specific painting, but a painting in this series that Manet did. That's another indication of the importance of these sources in Van Gogh's art, the sources of contemporary artists like Manet. There are a couple examples, again, I'll go into it in my next lecture in part 2, of old masters like Chardin or Rembrandt that were also influential to Van Gogh. And then during this period in Saint-Remy, I didn't want to leave this period by not mentioning the fact that one of the most famous, if not the most famous work by Van Gogh, the Starry Night, was produced during this period where he was able to go out of the grounds and look out into the surrounding countryside and paint. And this is a nocturne, which is actually an optimistic painting, because there are images of death, like the cypress tree that's found in cemeteries, or the comet that's a symbol of death traditionally. But the notion of the moon, a symbol of eternity, and the sense of cozy well-being by lights in the houses in the town, make this, and the brightness of the sky, make this ultimately an optimistic painting that it carries a message of hope, I think. So his last stay, and it only lasted 2 months, then he was dead, 70 days in Arles. He moved there in May, late May. He was dead by late July. And he produced about 70 works in 70 days. So he was very, very busy. And one of the reasons he moved there was to be with Dr. Paul Gachet, a homeopathic physician who was also an art collector that Van Gogh was drawn to and thought he could continue his treatments to improve his mental health beyond what had beyond the treatment he received at the asylum in Saint-Remy. So we have in the exhibition a lithograph, another lithograph by Van Gogh of Dr. Gachet that is connected with several versions of a portrait of Dr. Gachet. This is one of them in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And this is the environment in which he lived. It was a small town, Auvers. It was peaceful. It was tranquil. It was a kind of environment that he thought would do him well in terms of mental health. So this is typical, a scene of houses in that area, in that town. And I'm also happy that this was lent by the Toledo Museum of Art. We also have loans from the Cincinnati Museum of Art and from the Cleveland Museum of Art. So major Van Goghs from major Ohio museums, all in the Columbus Museum of Art for a few months. Very exciting. And we're so grateful for the generosity of those museums. The town was famous, Auvers, for a former resident, a Barbers school painter by the name of Charles-François d'Aubigny, who painted works like this that showed the townscape or the area around Auvers. And many paintings by Van Gogh were homages to the paintings of his great Barbizon school predecessor, d'Aubigny. This is an area that Les Vessinaux, it just refers to an area a district or an area in Auvers that was not far from the residence of Dr. Gogh. And the mature style of Van Gogh, even in this reproduction, you can see, I feel like if I ran my hand across the screen, it would be bumpy because of the thick texture of the way that he aggressively applied the pigment in the depicting these yellow flowers or plants in the foreground, for example, in that sky. We're not sure if this blue stroke is a portion of the sky, something abstract, or maybe a river or a stream, but it's one of the many intriguing aspects. And that nice red highlight of the house with the red roof, it pulls the composition into a focus. And then the innkeeper's daughter, he stayed in the Auberge Ravoux, the Ravoux Inn, and the daughter of the innkeeper, Adeline, was 13 at the time this was painted. This is in our exhibition. This is another version. She didn't like these portraits because she said it didn't look like her, and she does look older than 13 years old. And Van Gogh wrote about wanting to paint the modern portrait, a portrait that captures the inner life of the sitters. So he apparently thought that Adeline was an old soul, as it were. And this is a photograph of her. This is unfair because this is from the early 1890s. So she was probably a few years older when this photograph was taken, but you can judge for yourself the comparison. And then of interest, talking about the lore behind some of these paintings, this was in the Armory show, which was the first massive exhibition in America of modern European and American art. 300 artists, 1,300 works. It's a show that it attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors, the first exposure to many Americans to paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Van Gogh, and it traveled from New York to Chicago, where it was exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then to Boston. And the official title was the International Exhibition of Modern Art. And not only was this painting now borrowed from the Cleveland Museum in it, but the next painting, the last painting in the exhibition that I'll show, Undergrowth with Two Figures, another loan from the Cincinnati Museum. They also lent the peasant head that I showed earlier in preparation for the potato eaters. So this is often said to represent the gloomy, dark side of Van Gogh in his Auvers period. This is probably done, it could have been done weeks before his death. And it shows two figures that were painted in after the rest of the forest scene was completed. So they almost look ghost-like. And it remains a matter of controversy whether we should interpret these figures as being trapped between the trees and their different perspective systems, depending upon which portion of the composition you look at. So you could say there's no escape from the forest, they're trapped. On the other hand, others say that they're protected by the trees, so that it's not necessarily such a doomed, it's not necessary to say that they're doomed, but the background does look very dark and foreboding. But the title Undergrowth calls attention to the forest floor. That's the focus of the painting. And that's a long tradition in a landscape painting, especially the Barbers school. Here's another Barbers school painting showing a forest clearing with emphasis on the growth of the plants on the floor of the forest. And by the way, this is another example of the fugitive color. Some of these flowers would have been painted pink, but the color has faded. It still looks great, I think. And then the controversy swirls at one point about what was Van Gogh's last painting. It was long thought to be Wheat Field with Crows, but that has been discounted, although it is one of his last paintings. And some people have settled on this, Tree Roots, in the Van Gogh Museum of Amsterdam. And the question of whether his life ended in suicide versus there is a theory that was introduced in this biography of Van Gogh by Stephen Nafy and Gregory Wright Smith. I mentioned their collection and this book that Steve Nafee published in conjunction with the exhibition, they suggest that Van Gogh might have been the victim of bullying by teenage boys in the village of Auvers who made fun of this eccentric old man. One of them apparently had a gun that may have, so his death may have been accidental manslaughter, and that's one suggestion, and that Van Gogh was such a nice guy that he didn't want to get them in trouble, so he managed to, and whether he shot himself, and there are other arguments in favor of that, whatever the case, he managed to make it back to the attic room that he was staying at this inn, and he lasted in bed for several days. It wasn't the gunshot itself that killed him, apparently, but the infection that set in that wasn't treated. And sadly, within months of his death, his brother died. And so there are two books connected with this exhibition, not only the Steve Nafee book that I described that has many reproductions of paintings from his collection that are in the exhibition, but the catalog of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, which is published by or distributed by Yale University Press and the Santa Barbara Museum with the editor and author of one of the essays is Ike Kong, and many other wonderful scholarly essays in this volume. And so neither is an exact catalog that corresponds to the checklist of this exhibition, but both, I think, are of great interest and are valuable resources if you're interested in learning more about Van Gogh and the artists that he loved. And that concludes my remarks. I think my last slide is a blank. So thank you, and enjoy the show. Hope you can come back next week. I ran a little over. Thank you for staying. I'd be happy to answer questions if you want to come up to the stage individually, but please feel free to enjoy the rest of the afternoon and evening. Thanks.